What happened to your phone, you said, sir?
My family's looking to get some photos from this phone, iPhone 3GS from 2008. I'm trying to see if I can recover the data for family memories.
Don't worry, I got you. Who remembers those old SIM cards? Look at this battery. How swollen is this? How many parts it's pregnant? You're gonna replace this whole housing. This is all. Look at that. Your phone is ready, sir. Now it's good to go.
Nice. Family's gonna love this.
What happened to your phone, you said, sir?
My family's looking to get some photos.
I take you, body, in sickness and in health, for as long as we shall.
On April 30th, 1945, Hitler died in a bunker in war-torn Berlin. It was a brutal end for one of history's greatest monsters. The months leading up to his death were no less dramatic. By April 1944, exactly 1 year before Hitler's death, anyone who knew the reality of Germany's situation had to admit the war was lost. But in an off-the-cuff speech to some of the highest-ranking members of the Nazi Party, Hitler continued to insist they were facing a mere setback. It was the same stuff he'd been saying for years.
He has dimmed into his people by constant repetition the conviction that they are a super race, headed for a great destiny.
Turns out, they weren't. But here's the thing. Those who knew him best believed that this wasn't just an act, but something Hitler truly believed deep down. Up until at least the summer of 1944, Hitler told anyone who would listen that Germany would fail. As this belief became increasingly absurd, he gave up trying to use facts and logic to bolster his argument. Instead, he began insisting that a German victory was inevitable because God had ordained it. Hitler's many health issues grew much worse during the final year of his life. On top of the worsening symptoms of Parkinson's disease, Hitler suffered from a heart condition, stomach issues, skin problems, jaundice, and a polyp on his vocal cord that required surgery just 5 months before he died. Those close to him saw a man who was aging rapidly. His hair was graying, he hunched over when he walked, and his eyesight began to deteriorate. The Führer had once been known for his energetic, almost frenetic speeches to the German people. November 1944, however, he was so visibly unwell that he canceled the planned speech on the anniversary of Kristallnacht. Instead, one of his underlings read a statement. In order to keep going, Hitler relied on his doctor, Lt8t-HLDKg, and a staggering amount of drugs. Hitler had used drugs throughout World War II, but in his final year, he became more and more dependent on Morell's so-called cures. These drugs included methamphetamine, cocaine, and even poisons like strychnine. Historian Norman Ohler spoke of Hitler's drug use during an appearance on NPR's Fresh Air.
Hitler needed those highs to substitute his natural charisma, which he had in the years prior, but which he had lost.
Hitler might have believed the war could still be won for Germany, but his people knew what was really happening. Air raid sirens blared across Germany as the Allies bombed cities without end, while ordinary citizens lost more and more loved ones on the front lines. Even propaganda couldn't hide the bare fact of the matter. The German military was faltering, and the Soviets were coming ever closer. In early 1944, Hitler gave a speech on the radio to mark the 11th anniversary of his rise to power. But he no longer captivated his audience the way he had for the previous decade, and the reaction to the speech was harsh. Even Hitler could tell his hold over the German public was slipping. Because of this, he began to step away from public life. From 1944 onward, he stopped giving his famous public speeches and moved to increasingly isolated locations. Possibly due to his dramatically aged appearance, he refused to make regular appearances in newsreels as he used to. The Führer was so conspicuously absent from public life that rumor had it that he was already dead. Hitler was never able to find out when and where D-Day was going to occur, but he did know it was coming. It was clear for months before the landings at Normandy that the Allies would mount a major attack somewhere in Western Europe. And although you wouldn't think that anyone would look forward to facing a major invasion, Hitler actually wanted the Allies' attack to happen. During the spring of 1944, Hitler talked constantly about the inevitable invasion. The anticipation was stressful, sure, but he insisted that the German army would thoroughly crush the Allies when it came. He believed the Nazi victory would be so complete that both Churchill and Roosevelt would be overthrown as a result. Spoiler, things didn't quite work out that way. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the Nazi command was caught totally unprepared.
Unpeaceable pouring in from Berlin, claiming that the invasion has begun.
General Rommel was returning from a weekend away to celebrate his wife's birthday. Hitler was literally asleep. When he woke up, he became visibly thrilled by the news and only got more excited as the day went on. Joseph Goebbels recorded that it was as if a huge weight had been lifted from Hitler's shoulders now that the inevitable had finally happened. Even better, the Fuhrer was certain that the bad weather would help bring the speed of German victory. As the day wore on, however, it became clear that the Allied invasion was succeeding. From February to July 1944, Hitler lived full-time at the Berghof, his own personal mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. While there, he and his entourage existed almost in a fantasy world. Hitler and Eva Braun entertained their closest friends and subordinates, and they acted the perfect hosts since the Third Reich fell around them. Hitler slept late, sometimes until noon, and would then take part in hours-long meetings with his generals, where he planned, among other things, the final horrific stages of the Holocaust. But a lot of time at the Berghof was set aside for enjoyment. Hitler chatted freely with the wives of his underlings, asking about their children. There were hikes ending with tea and cake, and long dinners where discussions of war were maniac. Often, special events would take place at the Berghof. Braun hired a magician to perform at the retreat for 2 weeks. It was noted that Hitler seemed to particularly enjoy these shows. The final big party held there was the wedding reception of Braun's sister to an SS officer. In mid-July, Hitler left the Berghof and traveled to the secret military base with the fitting name, the Wolf's Lair. Hitler survived over 40 assassination attempts during his life, but the one that came the closest to succeeding occurred on July 20th, 1944 at the Wolf's Lair. The conspirators were Hitler's own senior officers, who had decided that he needed to be killed in order to prevent the total destruction of Germany. A seemingly random event meant that Hitler survived the attack. The bomb intended to kill him had been placed in a suitcase, which somebody moved behind a large table at just the wrong moment. 4 others in the room died when the bomb went off, but Hitler got away with hardly a scratch. Hitler's retaliation against the plotters was swift and brutal. A handful were executed within hours of the plot's failure, while the rest, and many hundreds more people besides, were put to death in the following days and weeks. Most of the victims were killed by firing squad, although a few suffered even worse fates. Erwin von Witzleben, a field marshal who'd helped lead the invasion of France in 1940, was hanged with a thin rope from a meat hook. The manner of von Witzleben's death was a personal order from Hitler, who wanted him to die like cattle in a slaughterhouse. A few conspirators did survive, however. The last, Ewald Heinrich von Kleist, died in 2018.
Ewald von Kleist was willing to make a difference in the history of his country and ultimately the history of the world.
Hitler's downward spiral only worsened after the July 20th plot. While he had never been a particularly rational human being, the realization that his own subordinates were capable of turning on him caused his mental state to collapse. The already paranoid Hitler shrunk his inner circle further and further, punishing or cutting out anyone who wasn't utterly devoted to him. At the same time, he gave huge amounts of power to 4 of his most loyal commanders: Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and Albert Speer. Despite what these men thought, however, Hitler wasn't handing them any real authority. The Nazi Party was still a cult of personality, one where power flowed from the Fuhrer alone. This dynamic saw the 4 men involved in a constant power play, one in which any one of them might earn more power by courting the leader's favor. Considering the dysfunction this caused at the heart of the Third Reich, it's perhaps no surprise that Germany failed to reverse its fortunes in the war. The most famous of the Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan, but a number of other nations fought alongside them. Fun fact, the last time the U.S. declared war officially was in 1942 against 3 of the lesser-known Axis countries: Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. This tentative alliance held from the beginning of the war until autumn 1944. Having faced a number of military setbacks, Romania, Finland, Bulgaria, and Hungary all left Germany in the lurch by surrendering, signing ceasefires, or, even in Romania's case, switching sides. Italy had already surrendered to the Allies the previous year, leaving Germany pretty much alone in Europe. By this point, even those close to Hitler felt that the best hope for Germany was to sue for peace, especially with the Soviet Union. Much of the pressure in this regard came from Germany's one real remaining ally, Japan. This was a cunning move by Japan. You see, the Soviets and the Japanese signed a neutrality pact in April 1941, and the Russians held true to that. But at the same time, the Japanese brass knew what was coming. So one way of holding on to what they had was to have Germany sue for peace. If Russia honored their deal and the Nazis were officially done, Japan might be able to keep all their spoils. In theory, of course. Yet, despite this being Germany's one chance of escape from total obliteration, Hitler refused to consider it. As 1945 approached, things never looked bleaker for Germany, until somehow they didn't. In November and December 1944, things nearly improved. The Allied advance in Europe had paused, and so Hitler decided to take advantage of this with one last military push. The Germans spent weeks planning a major counteroffensive in the Ardennes, one of that Hitler believed would turn the tide of the war. Moreover, Hitler had consolidated his power after the attempt on his life in July 1944. And there were even rumors in the German press that the country had almost finished constructing a secret weapon that could destroy the Allies. Well, Hitler had to know that the Nazis were nowhere near building an atomic bomb. He nonetheless spoke about it with an ally in August 1944, claiming that it was a real possibility for the Germans. Of course, it wasn't to be. The last of Hitler's hopes were crushed when his Ardennes offensive fell apart. Now known as the Battle of the Bulge, the German counterattack was a complete failure. As the calendar turned to 1945, Hitler ran out of options. Defeat was now utterly inevitable for the Third Reich. By the beginning of 1945, even Hitler was aware that time was running out, and so he turned to the question of survival. From January to his death in April, Hitler refused to leave the Chancellery building in Berlin. He spent most of his time in the air raid shelter beneath it with a small group of his closest advisors. These included Joseph Goebbels, Eva Braun, and various bodyguards and secretaries. One of those secretaries, Traudl Junge, eventually published her recollections of those final months. She remembered Braun throwing endless parties, the terror of the Allied bombardments, and how even the men who were closest to Hitler abandoned him as the end neared. By his final weeks, it was too dangerous for Hitler to even leave the so-called Führer bunker. He spent the last 10 days of his life on the ground. One of those secretaries, Traudl Junge, eventually published her recollections of those final months. She remembered Braun throwing endless parties, the terror of the Allied bombardments, and how even the men who were closest to Hitler abandoned him as the end neared. By his final weeks, it was too dangerous for Hitler to even leave the so-called Führer bunker. He spent the last 10 days of his life on the ground. The day before he died, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun. It was hardly a big event, considering everyone knew the end was imminent. But Hitler had always said that Braun would be the one who stayed with him until the end. The ceremony may have been a way for rewarding her for doing just that after 11 years together. On April 30th, 1945, the Soviets were on the brink of taking Berlin. Hitler said goodbye to those who remained with him in the Führer bunker and then went into a room alone with Braun. They both fit into cyanide capsules, which had been tested on his dog Blondie the day before. This is what killed Braun, although Hitler shot himself before the poison could take effect. And yes, that's a thing. Unlike what the movies tell you, there is a bit of time before the cyanide kicks in. Just enough to get them round off, I guess. Their bodies were burned in the courtyard of the Chancellery as Hitler had instructed. 7 days later, Germany surrendered to the Allies.
In the month of July, Ontario's unemployment hit 7.9%, up from 1.2% last year, making it the fourth worst province for a job seeker. and Toronto's jobless rate is staggering 9%, one of the highest in the country, and it jumped by 0.3% in just 1 month.
I can't find a job. I've been applying every single day, LinkedIn, Indeed, whatever the fuck. And it feels like this is just a problem that keeps getting bigger and bigger.
You know, the economy isn't getting any better. And honestly, I think that since the pandemic, it may have actually hit a point of no return. At least there was an excuse during the pandemic why a lot of businesses couldn't hire and also why the economy was in the gutter. But now that everything's open, why are other nations and other countries starting to prosper and Canada is on the decline? The job market is so bad in Canada, especially for young people, and we're going to talk about it in today's video. Canadian job markets, Canadian jobs, the situation is getting really bad in Canada.
I graduated in June and I can't find a job. I have been applying every single day, LinkedIn, Indeed, whatever the fuck. And it feels like this is just a problem that keeps getting bigger and bigger. Every single person I ask for references, for advice, for my resume, whatever. But people are just saying that they cannot, no one can find a job right now. People who are getting bachelor's, master's, those people can't find jobs. No one can find a job. What the hell is happening in Canada?
Literally, at this point, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees are starting to feel like just pieces of paper. And if those jobs can't lead you...
We tend to see Mr. Adolf as a force of nature, turning the wheels of history, one evil act after the other, as a sort of cold mastermind who was able to turn an entire nation into a factory of death and war. And although this is true, what we often don't learn about Hitler is that he was a profoundly odd person. Like, really odd. Now, that's not unusual for dictators. They all have their foibles and quirks, but I think Hitler might take first place for history's strangest tyrant, a man who was obsessed with health and hygiene, whilst at the same time taking obscure concoctions of amphetamines and bull semen, a man who was troubled by a flatulent stomach, which could make a room so stinky his inner circle would complain, whilst at the same time refusing to shake hands for fear of germs. Someone who, on the surface, seemed completely uninterested in women, but would go on to have such destructive relationships with them that every woman he was romantically entangled with would ultimately end their own life. A man who was profoundly shy and quiet, but nonetheless took the stage and rocked history. Today, we peel back the myth and take a stark look at the man.
Some economy class passengers can't enter first class and disturb our VIPs.
Sorry. Warts and all. Born in 1889 in Austria, young Adolf, or Adi to his mother, had a relatively quiet childhood. He suffered some abuse from his father, Alois, but historians disagree on how severe this was. Either way, Adolf would later write that as a child, he feared his father, whilst at the same time, his mother Clara was the opposite, doting, affectionate, and indulgent. This background would set the stage for what is arguably the weirdest thing about Hitler, his personal relationships, or lack thereof. During the First World War, Hitler would serve on the front, but he struggled to make friends with his comrades, and was always the odd one out. It didn't help that whilst other soldiers guzzled beer, smoked tobacco, and frequented brothels, the 25-year-old Adolf preferred to sketch or read political pamphlets. Now, this isn't in itself problematic. There's nothing wrong with self-control. But you could say that it was unusual for an early 20th century soldier to avoid alcohol, cigarettes, and women. This was part of what made him feel like a bit of a loner during the First World War, a feeling that I don't think ever actually left him. And we'll see later in the video how he'll go on to overcompensate for the feeling of being left out. For now, though, let's get back to that point about him not visiting brothels, because this is a theme that runs throughout Hitler's life and has left a big question mark in the endless books about him. See, sexually speaking, Hitler is a total enigma, which makes him quite unlike the average person, and most tellingly, very unlike other dictators. Stalin was a serial womanizer in his younger years, fathering several children from different mothers, but then became almost completely abstinent and monk-like after taking power in the 1930s. Mao Zedong was the other way around, slightly less successful in his younger years, but once established, he indulged in his voracious appetite for women, famously taking a plate of Hong Shao Rou and a virgin to bed every night. And of course, this was often exploitative in the process. Hitler, on the other hand, who knows? There's been lots of rumors about depraved interests or abusive tastes, but these are just rumors. Nothing about this part of his life has really been confirmed, leading some to say that he may have been asexual, or, being a germaphobe, may have had some severe hang-ups about the process itself. Either way, this fastidiousness was enough to raise some eyebrows, especially amongst another of his contemporary dictators, Benito Mussolini, who in almost stereotypical Italian fashion was very much a stallion in this regard. Although it must be said, like Mao, exploitation was often the reason for his impressive number of very young mistresses. In any case, in the 1930s, the two men actually met in Rome to discuss the future of fascism in Europe. Mussolini, who had always seen Hitler as a bit of a prude, suddenly came across a delicious morsel of confidential information. It had been reported that in the early hours of the morning, the Führer had called for a woman to be sent to his bedchamber. This little detail delighted Mussolini, who now finally had proof that the Führer was a man just like any other and with the same appetites. Mussolini was savouring his gotcha moment. Not so bloody pious now, are you? But, as it would actually transpire, here Hitler had actually called the lady up with other things in mind. He was to give a speech the next day and was fussing with the way his shirt had been ironed. The lady came to his room, ironed the shirt, starched the collar, and was briskly sent away. Mussolini found this revelation deflating, and once again found Hitler impossible to read. Again, none of this is in itself problematic behavior by any means. There's nothing wrong with this, but it does reveal something of Hitler's unusual character. Whereas others might be enjoying the perks of power, Adolf was busy obsessing over his personal appearance all the way into the dead of night. But, uninterested as he may have been, this feeling did not go both ways. When Hitler was doing his stint in Landsberg prison after the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, he'd managed to garner himself a respectable collection of groupies. Women who were charmed by his antics and took to him, bachelor as he was, with squealing adulation. In Landsberg, Adolf enjoyed relative freedom despite being technically imprisoned, and he was even allowed to have visitors in his private room. It would have been all too easy to have a Fraulein over to help pass the time. Unfortunately for the girlies, however, the only thing that actually ever got past the bars were the love letters and the one thing Hitler actually liked: the pastries. Baked with love from home and sent in to lift his spirits, it was ultimately no more than flour, sugar and butter that Hitler would truly indulge in, adding a bit of potch to his previously slender, undernourished frame. This would make Adolf Hitler one of the few prisoners in human history to have actually gained weight during his time in captivity. But hey, there are perks to any job, I suppose. Nonetheless, though, it wasn't as though the man was incapable of noticing the opposite sex. There would be only woe and misery to those who actually caught Hitler's eye. A few years after getting out of Landsberg, Hitler grew attached to his half-niece, Geli. In 1929, Geli, who was just 19, moved into Hitler's Munich apartment. The Führer would have been around 40 years old at the time.
The Alberta Cancer Foundation Lottery has the most cash prize choices in Alberta. There's over 1,000 prizes worth a total of $3.6 million. Get your tickets now at albertacancerlottery.ca. Formerly Cash and Cards Lottery, license number 7373868, 18 plus, Alberta only. Play responsibly.
Quite the age gap. Nonetheless, though, Hitler was smitten by her, and the two had an incredibly intimate relationship. There's a big question mark about whether this became more than just familial love, but Adolf certainly acted like more than just a loving uncle. The relationship broke down before long as Hitler began to obsessively control every aspect of her life. What she wore, who she saw, and even when she was allowed to leave the apartment. The older man was besotted. The younger girl was desperate for some relief from the doting but abusive uncle. In the end, Gelly could stand no more, and she tragically shot herself in the chest at the age of 23, 4 years after moving in with Hitler. Adolf had the whole scene wrapped up quickly to avoid outrage and any suspicion of foul play on his part, but the experience stuck with him, and he never really got over the loss of Gelly. Even if it had never been a proper relationship, or it was him that was responsible for driving her to this extreme end. Either way, lessons were not learned. His second public relationship, this time with Eva Braun, would also end the same way, although under different circumstances, with her also taking her own life just a few moments before Hitler did so himself in 1945, towards the end of the war. This meant that both of his intimate relationships ended in suicidal tragedy, a grim reminder of the deep personal darkness behind the public monster. But let's take a look at something other than relationships. Let's look at politics. See, one of the lesser-known stories is how Hitler actually got into politics, and it's quite interesting. Many know that he joined the German Workers' Party before climbing the ranks and morphing it into the National Socialist Party with himself at the helm. What many don't know is how Hitler actually found this party. After the end of the First World War, Germany's newly established Weimar Republic was incredibly unstable, being attacked on all sides by political extremism and civil violence. Hitler joined up as an intelligence officer during this period, and he was originally sent to spy on the German Workers' Party to see if they posed a threat to this fledgling state. Despite being sent to keep tabs on this unruly group, Hitler decided to join it, and he turned a potential threat into an actual disaster. I think it's painfully ironic that the state sent Hitler to control the future of this party, and then Hitler used this party to control the future of the state. There you are. In any case, Hitler's political affiliation came later in life, and although he's remembered primarily as a fierce public speaker, able to capture and adulate the crowd, this wasn't always the case. We mentioned earlier that in the First World War, Hitler was quiet and withdrawn, and this was also true of his early speeches. He was actually pretty woeful on stage, at least at first, but after some religiously applied practice, he got good. And I say religiously applied practice because Hitler would rehearse his speeches non-stop before appearing on stage. Not just the script or the tone or the delivery, but every last detail, even down to the facial expressions and the hand gestures, leading to some truly bizarre photographs like these. This isn't Hitler during a speech, it's him practicing for one. But it looks so extreme. And as a performer myself, I can't imagine ever getting this passionate in front of nothing but an empty room and an awkward photographer. But hey, maybe that's what separates the professionals from the rest of us. But back to politics, Hitler had some beliefs about the world that were just bizarre. Whereas some believed in God and others were purely materialistic about the world, Hitler walked a middle ground, sort of mixed up with paganism and folklore, and a lot of his inner circle were subscribed to this stuff too. Most famously is Rudolf Hess, who believed in divination and tried to find ways to levitate, and Heinrich Himmler, who had an obsession with the Norse god Odin, the Holy Grail, and numerous other occult interests. This Germanic spiritualism, if you could call it that, would even affect Hitler's performance on the world stage. Returning once more to Benito Mussolini, when the two were discussing politics one evening, Hitler told the Italian dictator that he was, quote, mystically and scientifically convinced of being possessed, not by a demon or by God, but by a spirit from Aryan mythological prehistory. Mussolini would later say that this comment left him utterly disoriented. Now, I know that these two characters are responsible for some of the darkest moments of the 20th century and have forever stained human history with blood and tragedy. But my God, I just cannot help but be amused by the relationship between these two men. Here they are, utterly dependent on one another throughout the Second World War, and yet, despite the constant meetings and exchanges, these two men have nothing in common with each other than the shared politics of fascism. But even then, they have totally different interpretations as to what fascism actually is. And these two stooges, constantly competing with one another, rambling in broken German about women or Aryan mythology, both completely incompetent in their own ways, talking past one another, equally baffled by the other, and yet, despite their ridiculous personal antics together, they're able to somehow hold Europe hostage for half a decade. It's nuts. Anyway, that's enough on politics, so let's get into some hobbies and foibles to once again drive home just how strange this man was. Firstly, Hitler loved animals, firstly doting on his German shepherd, Blondie, and his love for these beasts would go so far that he would even declare himself vegetarian, eating simple meals like porridge and buckwheat, while his officers munched on meat. But behind closed doors, despite his public displays of abstentiousness,
First, it was extremely painful to realize that my daughter and I, we weren't stable. Without reaching out for help, I don't know where we would have ended up. The day that I started realizing that I feel really good about my position in life, I came in with my shoulders rolled back and my chin up, and it was just like I did this.
Hitler was known to sneak a bratwurst or two, or if feeling especially pleased with himself, would enjoy his favourite, Leberknödel, dumplings made from pork and beef liver. So, yes, in his own way, even Hitler wasn't immune to the pleasures of the flesh. Many, of course, also know that Hitler was refused entry to art school and was a passionate painter during his younger years. And although I'm no art critic, others have said that his paintings can be pretty solid, but he struggles to paint people in a compelling way, perhaps showing his deep-seated disinterest in others. Other pre-war critics have been less generous of Hitler's paintings. In 1936, American journalist John Gunter wrote that his paintings were prosaic, utterly devoid of rhythm, colour, feeling, or spiritual imagination. No wonder the Vienna professors told him to go to an architectural school and give up pure art as hopeless. Although it should be said that Hitler had applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, which was probably the most prestigious school for these kinds of paintings at the time. And so if Adolf had just set his sights a little lower, he probably would have been accepted into another art school, but as we've seen so far, he's not a man to do things by half measures. Hitler also hated germs and was obsessed with his health, often refusing to shake the hands of those around him for the sake of hygiene. And this obsession was exploited by quack doctors around him, who would keep him dosed up on a pharmacy's worth of drugs, stimulants for the mornings, relaxants for the evenings, even depots of bull semen for vitality. This also began to take a toll on his physical and mental health, and by the end of the war, he was pretty out of it. He also disliked early mornings, so much so that on D-Day, when the Allies swept onto the beaches of France on the 6th of June 1944, none of Hitler's staff would dare to come into his room and deliver the news. It was too scary to disturb him. The Nazis actually became aware of the invasion at about 4 a.m. that day, but it wouldn't be until 10 a.m. that the Fuhrer would rise and hear of the disaster, by which point the Allies had already secured their beachheads and were bringing in new reinforcements. General Alfred Jodl would later defend the decision not to wake Hitler prematurely, saying the Fuhrer had to be in a good mood to make clear decisions. But although he disliked germs and early mornings and liked animals and art, Hitler had one other interest, especially in his later years: talking. Once top dog, Hitler would go on to hold monologues during dinner parties, which could be several hours long, and those attending were obliged to indulge him. The man who was once left out and ignored during the First World War was now the center of attention and head of the clique. This wouldn't have been too bad for those involved. We've all had to share a meal with a boss or relative who dominates conversation. Nothing new there. But there was one thing about Hitler that made these evenings a bit of an issue. His stomach. Hitler was incredibly and unfortunately flatulent, often creating a bit of a stink for his guests. This may have been the real reason for his plain diet, rather than any ethical foibles about eating meat. Things got worse in this regard as Hitler got older too. His secretary, Trudel Junge, would go on to say that his digestive issues could make meetings quite uncomfortable for those in the room. Albert Speer would also later say that his flatulence, quote, affected those nearby. One can't help but to imagine the smell in those last few days of Hitler's life. Stuck in a stale bunker, cramming tinned food into an anxious stomach, waiting for the Russians to come and exact their revenge. Quite the aroma. Anyway, that's Hitler. Isolated, neurotic, self-absorbed, and quite strange. Now, quirks and eccentric.
Yeah. Sorry? I'm actually part of a student under 16, a lot of them, so I'd really appreciate if we weren't recording. I understand it's you're in the UK, right? You're in the UK. Yeah, I understand. You don't have to wear any of this crap off. That's fine.
What is his biggest dream in sport? A picture with the respected Marshal Kim Jong-un.
In our country, as you can witness, is the safest place on earth. You know, there's no crime, no people, no murders, something like that, There's no gray market for sure.
Okay, so you don't need a prison.
Yeah, of course.
Our people have to become fit to be able to defend ourselves against the Americans. We have come to this water park today. I can sense the love of our respected Marshal Kim Jong-un here. Solely for our pleasure, he has built this water park. It moves me so much, I can hardly put it into words.
Our respected Marshal has opened this riding club to provide each and every Korean with the possibility to ride.
Islam.
What happened to your Xbox, you said, sir? This is my son's Xbox. All of a sudden it stopped working. It's showing a no signal on the TV. Is that something that you can repair or fix for me?
No one. I got you.
Yeah, good job.
Your ex.
Starting a company is so daunting. When you're building a business, you are totally looking for the best advice. Owner gave me all the advice and resources that I needed to take my...
By the spring of 1944, things were looking grim for Nazi Germany. Already starved of key resources and under severe pressure in the east, the Western Allies were now poised to launch their long-awaited invasion of Western Europe. And yet, Germany's leader, Adolf Hitler, was, despite everything, looking forward to D-Day. His plan was simple: reinforce the Western defences, launch a furious counterattack, and throw the Allies back into the sea. After that, he could turn his full strength against the Soviet Union and end the war. For Hitler, the outcome of this campaign would be decisive. In the previous episode of our D-Day series, we looked at the air battle for Normandy. This time, we're covering the fight